Unity offers a really nice feature to create natural terrain. Maybe you want to create mountains, valleys, rivers, or maybe you have a combination of some organic terrain, and then maybe also some buildings placed or flat surfaces. So I'll show you the workflow to do this. I'm going to actually delete that object to start with. And then the first step is you can go up to Game Object, 3D Object, and choose Terrain here to start the process. And it actually inserts an object that you're going to see labeled Terrain over in the Hierarchy panel. Might zoom out a little bit or zoom in. The checkerboard, by the way, represents 1 square per meter. I think I'll zoom out to see more. And you can choose terrain over in the hierarchy and then look in the inspector panel for settings. So first I see terrain here, and there's several tools and buttons here to get into different options. And probably the best workflow is to select your terrain object and then click the gear icon to open up settings to start with. And there's actually quite a few options. And I'm going to scroll down first to mesh resolution. And I'm going to start with this section. Width and height is going to tell it how many meters you want the area to be. So I think for this example, I'm just going to create something that is 200 meters square. And it just depends on what you want for your project, maybe how much room you're working with. And then terrain height is going to affect the maximum height you're allowed. So you kind of think about how tall do you want your biggest mountain to be, highest peak. So I think for my project, 500 meters, I think would be a good maximum. And then detail resolution can be impacted. This relates a little bit to how much fine detail you can add to it. And I think I'll leave that at its default setting for the moment. And then there's one more setting I would like to look at under texture resolution. And you're going to locate height map resolution. This also impacts how much detail you can have in file size. And I'm going to actually lower this one to 257 by 257. I think that'll offer enough resolution for my project and keep the size down a little bit. Okay, I think we're done with the main settings. So I'll scroll back up. And I want to remind you that we're in terrain and in the gear to get into the settings. But next step is we're going to choose the brush labeled Paint Terrain and work here for a little bit. And there's a menu to start with, and something I'd like to do is change the height of the default terrain. What's actually happened is it's at the moment flat. It's at the very bottom of the surface, but I think it's a good idea to raise the terrain so that you can paint in mountains or you can paint in holes to create things like river valleys. If you start at 0, it's kind of harder to do that. So if you like the idea, you go to this little menu, we'll hit set height. And then you can type in a height that you want to work with, and then we're going to click flatten tile to make it take effect. Like maybe to experiment first, I'm just going to try a value like 10 meters, and then when I hit flatten tile, you can see it moving up. So you can experiment with that. You can also drag, by the way, to adjust these values just to the left of where I was typing, and then hit flatten tile to lift it again to execute. Let's see what it would look like if it was at about 50 meters, and then I'll hit flatten tile. That way, again, if it's starting with the terrain above 0, then I can either lift up or make holes easily in my surface. I think the next step is the fun part. We're going to start to paint in mountains and hills and such. So I want to stay in the paintbrush tool. But instead of set height, let's change the menu to raise or lower terrain. And then there's a variety of brushes with different settings you can choose here. I'm going to pick the second one over that is round and it has soft edges. So it'll make the transition softer. And then you can adjust the size down here. Can kind of drag or type in values. I'm going to set it to about 30 or so as a size. That might depend on how big your terrain is, you know. And actually, if you place the cursor over it, you can already see the size. So that might help me make a decision about how big a brush I want to work with. And then the opacity can impact how fast it occurs. So I recommend a value of maybe 10 or so. Will slow it down enough to be useful. And then at this point, I just start painting. As soon as you drag, you'll see that it's lifting, it's creating hills. And I can change settings, you know, like maybe I want a bigger brush for a couple areas. Then I can switch to smaller brush, go back maybe to the 30. What I'm going to do on mine is paint in a bunch of mountains around the area. I plan to have maybe some buildings or something in the center. And then to do the opposite, to have it go down, you hold the shift key and start to drag. So for example, I'm going to create almost like a moat in between the mountains in the center area for my game. Or maybe if I have a mountain I think is too high, I can hold shift and start to drag over it to finesse the shapes. So it's really kind of funny. Just dragging is lifting, shift and dragging is reducing the height. It's fun. And you can change brushes again or change settings while you're working. Let's zoom in a little closer. Some of the terrain hills look too smooth, so you can add more texture. There's several brushes that have kind of a textured appearance, and you can use those to add texture. Maybe I'll go to a little slightly smaller brush, and I can start to drag over it to add more detail. So it's lifting as I drag. If you want to kind of pull down, just hold shift, and it's sort of eroding away the edges. Maybe I'll erode a little bit from the edges here with shift and dragging. So again, sometimes adding texture can help. Maybe I'll go slightly bigger brush, just to add less tiny details, a little bigger details with a larger brush. And you can also choose smooth height. Maybe I'll use a regular round brush for this. If you think an area is too textured, if you want to sort of like soften edges, smooth again is kind of a nice feature, smooth height. Sometimes when I've painted in something like these mountains, I might want to create a flat surface to place them in like a building. And earlier I kind of like avoided one section, but there's a little different way to create flatter surfaces. Let me add a little more texture in here, because you can go to your brush and go back to set height. And instead of hitting flatten tile, which impacts everything, you can set a height and paint instead. So earlier I had set like that base height I worked with at 50. And I think what I'll do is set a limit that's a little bit higher. I'm going to go to 60 meters. And then I'll go over to one region in paint. You can zoom in to see the impact on that. And it'll lift up the area as I'm dragging until it hits the limit. So that, again, this could be useful to have some regions that are flat. Maybe I want to place a flat plane or a building in certain areas. And then have others that are more organic. Just painting a little bit of like a flat surface to create a base area. And you know, one workflow is once you're finished painting to create your terrain, maybe flat a little bigger area, then you could consider adding other objects. So for example, if you want something very geometric like a foundation for a building, you could go to Game Object, 3D, and insert a cube, and then just start to scale that. You know, maybe I'll go over here and quickly make my cube larger. Start to type in some values. And again, I can add a mixture of geometric shapes along with your terrain. This over here. And I think maybe I'll reduce the height. So we go back to scale. This time I'll just pull it down. So again, you can have a mixture of things. So there could be a terrain that looks organic, and then you can start to place buildings, other geometric shapes, or your 3D models on top of it.